Shalom and welcome to Yeshiva B'nai Noach. I'm Tom Averna, and we are continuing our class Judaism 101. Today we're going to be presenting the life cycles portion of the class. The editors of the Book of Jewish Knowledge quotes the sages in saying that the human being is a miniature universe. They go on to say the saga of an individual lifespan, birth, maturation, marriage, procreation, achievement, and legacy, and then the passing to a new state of being in the world to come mirrors the story of a people, of mankind, and of creation as a whole. As Judaism commemorates the milestones of national and universal history, so does it establish the practices and rituals that infuse meaning into the stepping stones of our individual progress from the womb to the grave and beyond, and that is what we will be looking at today. These are the books used for the information presented in the class. Essential Judaism by George Robinson. This book is particularly geared towards Christians and Judaism understanding. We have Rabbi Telushkin's Jewish Literacy, another one for Christians here, and then a book, Living Judaism. The Book of Jewish Knowledge is a very interesting, colorful book presentation. It's a large, kind of a coffee book style. But again, these books then have given much of the information that is provided in this class. Ecclesiastes 1 says, "A season is set for everything, a time for every experience under heaven, a time for being born and a time for dying, a time for planting and a time for uprooting the planted, a time for slaying and a time for healing, a time for tearing down and a time for building up, a time for weeping and a time for laughing, a time for wailing and a time for dancing, a time for throwing stones and a time for gathering stones, a time for embracing and a time for shunning embraces, a time for seeking and a time for losing, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for ripping and a time for sowing, a time for silence and a time for speaking, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for war and a time for peace." Birth is our beginning on this plane of existence. Our very first commandment is to be fruitful and multiply. Birth represents our hope for the future and our belief in the potentiality of each of us. When a child comes forth, the future is an unwritten book. Every person comes here with a mission that's uniquely his or hers to accomplish. With every birth, there's the hope that this one will be the Messiah or the mother of the Messiah. There's also a belief in Judaism that we have opportunities in this world unavailable in the world to come. As the Midrash Tanhuma says, quote, "The Creator says to the soul, unwilling to leave their home, the world to which I am sending you is better for you than the one in which you have dwelt," unquote. And the Tzemach Tzedek said, quote, "But when the soul comes into the body, into a place of spiritual darkness and constriction, and it overcomes the concealments of the material world, the soul becomes a journeyer, ascending level after infinite level. For the source of the physical creation is even higher than the spiritual," unquote. Abraham's pleading with God for a child teaches us that a father's attitude toward a child must be that this is the greatest treasure given to us from God. The Talmud also answers the question of whether man is inherently good or not good, saying, quote, "The child in his mother's womb is taught the entire Torah, but when it emerges into the open air, an angel comes and slaps the child on the mouth, making it forget. The child does not leave the womb until it is made to swear the following oath: be righteous and do not be wicked. And even if the entire world tells you that you are righteous, regard yourself as if you are wicked." This paradox teaches us that we can never truly attain righteousness, but through humility we must try. Therefore, in potential, every human soul is born righteous. It is through our education in Torah that we must learn to choose rightly. We also then, the next step would be the bris, or the baby naming, or the bris and the baby naming, I should say. Just as being fruitful was our first commandment, circumcision was our first ritual and the sign of a new covenant that we entered into with God. So the next step then would be the bris, which is the circumcision that takes place. That was commanded in Genesis 17. It doesn't confer identity, but it marks identity. Medical science has also proven the importance of the eighth day as a time when blood develops the ability to clot in infants, as well as for the circumcision itself. It's an important time. There's a special chair for Elijah, Eliyahu, just as at the Passover Seder. Our hope that in fulfilling the mitzvahs we will hasten the coming of Messiah is the primary reason that we want to welcome Elijah in. Afterwards, Kiddush is recited and the name given. So the next step then is the baby naming. Our name, especially our Hebrew name, is very important. No name is given without God allowing it to be given, because it designates our purpose here. So even though we think we're coming up with a name, Judaism teaches that God is inspiring us, if we'll listen, to give us the right name for the child. It is Rabbi Chaim Vital said that this is a mystical event, saying, quote, "When a child is born, the father or mother calls their child by a name that first arises in their minds. This is not random or arbitrary. Rather, God places in their mouth the name that is needed for this soul," unquote. In spite of the rabbi's comment, we should choose carefully. One tradition is to name a child only after an honorable deceased relative. The reason we choose a deceased relative is that you don't know how that life will go. So you want to choose someone that we know has ended their life as overall being honorable. The next ritual to be done under those that are Torah observant, at any rate, is the Pidyon Haben, the redemption. It's a far less common ritual today, but it was the first commandment given in Egypt in Exodus 13. The parent is given the choice to redeem their son or dedicate him to service. And this is the redemption of the firstborn. The 31st day from birth is when this takes place. $5 silver. Not every male needs to be redeemed. Only the firstborn son, unless they're the son of a Cohen or a Levite. Father must redeem with those $5 silver. The next step to talk about, somewhat controversial, although very clearly in Torah, given in Exodus 1:22, we seem to see that the fetus is not as valued as human life, and abortion is permitted to save the life of a mother. Still, it is not encouraged in any way. Rabbis recognize the fetus as a potential human life. Argument of some that a woman has the right to choose since it's her own body is offset by the reminder that our bodies are on loan to us from God. Another possible aspect of lifestyle when child birthing is not available to a couple is the possibility of adoption. In relation to natural parents, adoption is irrevocable. So an adopted child cannot take on the tribe or religion of the adopted parent, but must choose to convert if they are a non-Jew. This would be primarily an older adoption in terms of that. The next stage in the life cycles would be that of parent and child. And the relation of God to creation is seen in the relationship of a parent to their child, which is why it's so important. It is the fifth commandment given in Exodus 20, and the significance of its location is that if you see the 10 commandments on the two tablets, you have 5 on one side, 5 on the other. The 5 on one side are commandments related to the 5 on one side, then are commandments related to God. The 5 on the other side are commandments related to man. At the very end of the side of God is the the fifth commandment, to honor your father and your mother. The significance of that is that the father and the mother are the representatives to the child of God. What they see in their parents, they see in God. So it's very important as part of that understanding as parents to make certain that you are presenting to your children the aspects that God of a godly life. We also see an interesting, not commandment so much as a punishment, or at least a concern. In Deuteronomy 21:18 through 21, we find the section on a rebellious son, and that the consequence given in Deuteronomy for that rebelliousness is actually death. So the point is that no one, as far as we know, and most likely historically, rebellious sons were not put to death, but they had the potential to be, because it was so important to recognize that that rebelliousness against parents is a rebelliousness against God, and that needed um, to be discouraged as strongly as possible. Again, demonstrating the importance of the relationship between the parent and the child. Each parent has a role in raising. The father must educate about Judaism, teach right from wrong, teach a trade, and provide for their daughter's future and a son's wife. A mother is also obligated to teach their children, as well as run an observant Jewish household, teaching daughters both domestic and Jewish training. A mother's role is vague, but unquestionably, she is at the center of the Jewish life of her family. A child's obligation is to honor, obey, respect, fear, and provide for their parents when they cannot provide for themselves. Same essential, the honor, obey, respect, and fear again is that obligation that we have towards God as well. They are also commanded to honor, children are commanded to honor their parents beyond the grave. We'll talk about that a little later on, but the idea of yahrzeits and remembering in prayer those who have passed. We are not, however, and this is an important distinction, we are not commanded to love our parents, only to respect them. So a huge difference there, and sometimes that difference is an important one, especially when we do have parents that are not raising us or providing for us that nurturing atmosphere that God provides. So we don't see God in our parents, but still we have the obligation to respect them. The obligation of parents towards their children, then, one of the aspects of this is quoted from Daniel Nevins, Rabbi Daniel Nevins, from his book, The Observant Life. And he had this to say: parenting is not an easy task. Our tradition recognizes that and gives some suggestions. The Mishnah and Talmud explore the responsibilities of parents toward children and of children toward parents in Tractate Kiddushin. The sources teach us that parents are obligated to circumcise and redeem their sons, to teach all of their children Torah, to teach them a trade, and to see to their marriage. These are in addition to the basic obligation of feeding, housing, and clothing. In general, we may understand these ancient obligations to stand for giving children the spiritual, intellectual, physical, and social skills necessary to live productive and meaningful lives. In terms of teaching children, the Torah outlines the educational responsibilities of parents towards their children clearly and unambiguously, with statements such as, quote, "You shall teach these words," part of the Shema, describing God's unity and the obligations to love God diligently. You shall teach them diligently to your children, Deuteronomy 6:7. Still, although parents may be their children's first and foremost formative teachers, most parents will also need to provide professional instructors to complete their children's education. Parents should seek to maximize their children's exposure to the ideas and sacred texts of our religion. Education must always be tailored to the specific needs and aptitudes of the people to whom it is being addressed. Even more important than intellectual attainment is the spiritual growth of each individual child. The book of Proverbs repeatedly speaks of the joy felt by parents when their children act wisely, and of the terrible suffering experienced by parents whose children behave badly. Toward the end of the book of Genesis, Judah captures this dynamic powerfully in attempting to explain why his father Jacob cares so deeply for his youngest son Benjamin. He loves him as intensely as he does, Judah explains, quote, because their souls are bound up with the others. Genesis 44:30. Nevertheless, parents must learn to see their child's development as an internal process, not primarily as a reflection of the parents of their own worth. At Proverbs 22:6, we read, quote, teach a child in the way to go, and even in old age, that one will not stray from it. The goal of Jewish parenting is to raise children to adulthood by teaching them to sanctify life and serve as God's partners in perfecting the world. The Jewish values of hospitality, kindness, tzedakah, and modesty should be showcased at the times of our greatest joy. This is the proper Jewish way of celebration that parents must teach their children, especially in an age of affluence. Regarding disciplining children, in the Bible, God employs persuasion, punishment, and even aloofness in order to motivate stiff-necked Israel to return to the Torah's ideals. Famously, the book of Isaiah opens, Isaiah 1, verse 2, with a bitter complaint leveled by God against Israel, saying, I have raised and exalted my children, yet they have rebelled against me, unquote. Yet the role of the prophet is ultimately to help Israel feel that God is reaching out to them, to reassure them of God's love, even at times of estrangement. So too, parents must find creative and varied ways to reach their children, even when they stray very far from the family's values and practices. When parents discipline a child, it may be difficult for the child to accept that guidance with love. Therefore, it is essential that parents begin positively by modeling the type of conduct that they wish to see in their children. That modeling should always take place before discipline. They must also resist the temptation to cover up all of a child's shortcomings, which would be the opposite extreme. Parents whose children do not respond to verbal discipline should institute a logical, reasonable series of consequences to guide their children back to proper behavior. Each child needs to learn to live within limits established by his or her parents. A failure to discipline children is not a sign of love, it's an abdication of parental responsibility and may indeed lead the children to what the rabbis called tarbut ra'ah, a vulgar pattern of poor behavior. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, cited by Rabbi Yochanan in the Talmud in Tractate Berachot, describes Tarbut Ra'ah in a home as more painful than the apocalyptic battle of Gog and Magog. The Halakha warns parents not to demand excessive displays of respect from their children, lest the strategy backfire. Indeed, one reason that a parent is warned not to hit an older child is that the child might be tempted to strike back. That's from Tractate Moed Katan. The codes of law state that one who beats an older child should be warned that such behavior will more than likely be counterproductive, and such a parent should even be placed under a ban. Although corporeal punishment has frequently been practiced by parents and is even justified in the Bible, Proverbs 23, 13, and 14, we now understand that the Talmud's warning against striking older children should be applied more broadly, and not solely because the struck child might strike back. Injuring a child physically or emotionally is forbidden by Jewish law. The resentments and long-term impact created by the physical punishments of children may have horrific ramifications. Truly abusive parents may forfeit their right to be honored and attended by their children. Instead, parents must discipline children in a firm but reasonable fashion that reinforces the same positive values the parent is seeking to inculcate. And we're also reminded of the verse that talks about God chastens whom he loves. Again, that same idea that discipline is not a form of cruelty, at least it shouldn't be. It should simply be a way to help children who may not understand in any other way the importance of obedience. In terms of adopted children, what are the obligations of parents to their adopted children? The short answer, the same as with biological children. If an adopted child's birth mother is not Jewish, then the adoptive parents are obligated formally to convert their child with the rituals of circumcision when applicable, and immersion in a kosher mikveh under the supervision of a rabbinic court. Continuing with Jewish education, and this is primarily now moving into the older child, and we mentioned the possibility of needing to hire a professional to teach your child, and that's what we'll be looking at here. A student of the 11th century scholar Peter Abelard observed, quote, "A Jew, however poor, if he had 10 sons, he would put them all to letters, not for gain as the Christians do, but to understanding of God's law, and not only his sons, but his daughters." So there you have it from Rabbi Abelard, that daughters and sons are both have an obligation to be taught. Deuteronomy 6 gives us God's commandments to educate our children, saying, quote, "And these words which I command you this day shall be upon your heart, and you shall teach them thoroughly to your children, and you speak of them when sitting in your home, when walking on the road, when you lie down, and when you rise." In Hebrew, chinuch means education and consecration. It's a training for life itself. So it begins first at home. And the tradition is at 3, a child learns simple prayers and perhaps begins that, and in the process then begins their study of Hebrew. At 5, they are then obligated to begin the study of Torah at a very simplistic level, but still that Torah study becomes very important. At 10, then the child progresses from Torah to studying the Mishnah, the part of the Talmud, the earliest part. At 15, they will study the other parts of the Talmud as well, Gemara and the commentaries. Girls used to be excluded, but even in Orthodox communities today, that is no longer the case. But they are rigorously taught, and generally by the mother. All participate and learn from festivals. Roots of Jewish communal education goes back to the 2nd century before the Common Era, with Rabbi Simeon ben Shittach, who established the first schools. In the 1st century of the Common Era, Rabbi Joshua ben Gamliel arranged for all Jewish communities to have their own teachers. These were the first community-sponsored schools in the history of Western civilization. That's the importance of education to the Jew. The Talmud honors him, this teacher, by saying, "Indeed, there is a certain individual who must be remembered for the good, and his name was Joshua ben Gamliel. Were it not for him, the Torah would have been forgotten in Israel." Unquote. At first, if a child had a father, his father taught him Torah. If he had no father, he did not learn Torah. Then they made an ordinance that teachers of children should be appointed in Jerusalem. Still, if a child had no father, he would not be taken up to learn. They subsequently ordained that teachers should be appointed in every district, and pupils were accepted at the age of 16 or 17. But a student whose teacher got angry with him would rebel and leave the school, until Joshua ben Gamliel came along and established that teachers of young children should be appointed in every district and in every town, and that children should enter the school at the age of 6 or 7. And with that, all of that changed. The rate of literacy among Jews is considerably higher, as one would expect in these situations, mostly educated in Jewish writings. However, the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Eliyahu ben Shlomo, in the 17th century, encouraged the study of sciences as well. He prophesied the coming of the Industrial Revolution and warned that if Jewish scholars were not taught and teaching the sciences, It would be dominated by godless men, and its purpose, which was to help us understand the mysteries of God, would be lost. Sadly, his prophecies went unheeded and came true. This is the meaning of the verse, educate a child in the way he should go. Even when they grow old, they will not turn away from it. If we direct a child in the path that is consistent with their nature, they will not abandon it later in their lives. If, however, we compel a child to follow a path that is inconsistent, or rather inconstant, with their nature, the child may listen to us now in deference to our authority, but afterwards, when they grow older, they'll turn away from the education that we gave them. So again, the idea to talk about here in a little more detail is the idea raised by the Gaon of Vilna in terms of educating as part of the religious education, also the science education, uh, and his concern. And what we see as a result of that is that, interestingly enough, the outpouring of knowledge of science and of modern technology was still given primarily to the Jew. Many Nobel Prize winners, scientists, those who made great discoveries were Jewish and are Jewish today. The problem, or the concern that the Gaon had, was that, and what has proven true, is that many of these, if not most of these Jews who have this knowledge, are not religious, so they are not connecting it as it was supposed to be connected to the mysteries of the Torah, of the Talmud, and of the Kabbalah. And that is what we are missing today. And that's why science and religion are disparate, are not connected to one another as they should be. Continuing then with the education, so we have, again, as we mentioned, the room, the study room, first century, we have Simeon ben Shittach, and then the first century of the Common Era, Joseph ben Gamla, that created the Cheder room. So the next invention, if you will, was the yeshiva. According to tradition, the institution of the yeshiva predates even the giving of the Torah, however. And so when we say it was invented in the 17th century, we're not saying that that was the first time it appeared. There is a tradition in Judaism that Shem and Eber, Noah's sons and grandson, led a yeshiva in which Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all studied. Accordingly, before Jacob and his clan relocated to Egypt, he sent Judah to establish a yeshiva there as well. After the Torah was given, the yeshiva was where the Torah and the oral traditions were passed on from generation to generation. It wasn't necessarily a building, but it was whenever two or more gathered together, then you had the yeshiva. The yeshiva was there. It was the place of learning. During the Second Temple era, there were large yeshivot led by the great sages of the day. The teachings of these academies were recorded in the Mishnah, the Midrash, Gemara, and other texts from that period. And this continued even after the Jewish people were exiled. As the Jewish community in the Holy Land truncated, got smaller, the yeshivot of Bavel, modern-day Iran and Iraq, or Babylon, rose in prominence as centers of Jewish scholarship. During the period of the Rishonim, the rabbis from 1000 to 1500 of the Common Era, were replaced by yeshivot in Spain, the Sepharad, and France and Germany, the Ashkenaz. In many communities, the rabbi of the city also led a yeshiva. These were often ad hoc affairs in which students studied in a small annex to the rabbi's home or the local synagogue. It was, again, the Vilna Gaon in the 17th century that encouraged yeshivas to include secular teachings as well, and thereby eliminate any need for non-spiritual secular education. The 19th century would see a slightly different innovation of the yeshiva movement. A new wave of yeshivot opened in Central and Eastern Europe. With the official staff, curricula, and study halls, they infused Torah study with purpose, dedication, and pride, Notable examples include the Volozhin Yeshiva in 1896. Rabbi Shalom Dovber Schneerson, the fifth Chabad Rebbe, opened a unique yeshiva in the Russian city of Lubavitch, where, in addition to the long hours dedicated to Talmud and Jewish law, a significant part of the day, morning and evening, was devoted to the study of Hasidic teachings. And the next step then, after the yeshiva, after a student would have spent years and years of study, the next process is the shmika for the Hasids. The shmika is the laying on of hands. Some believe that there really is no true ordination of rabbis in the modern times, because there was a requirement to use a specific oil that is no longer available. It was in the temple. So there's some discussion as to whether or not shemikas actually still take place, but at any rate, that is the process. This is the process of ordination today that's often the culmination of yeshiva study. So taking a look at the process, if you will, of that study. For the first 3 or 4 years, a student attends a high school equivalent, often called a masifta, the Aramaic term, or yeshiva. This is followed by a 3 or 4 year program called either Beit Medrash, a study hall, or Tzal, which means the same thing in Russian and Yiddish, or Yeshiva Gedolah, the large yeshiva. Since the 1970s, this has been followed by a year of shlichut, when the students would be sent as the Rebbe's emissaries to cities all around the world. And to clarify here, what we're talking about is Hasidic education. I may not have mentioned that at first, but we're looking at a process that Hasidic rabbis would go through. So the next step is the shlichut, the emissaries, the ones who are sent out. If you will, think of them as interns, I suppose, just beginning the process. Typically, they form the nucleus of a yeshiva at their destination cities. Most are a 1-year stint. This year is often a time of personal growth as young men find themselves in positions of responsibility. The next step at this point, the student is typically in his early 20s, will begin studying the prerequisites for his shmicha, rabbinic ordination. By the time a student has completed his ordination at age 22 or 23, he is often ready to consider marriage and starting a family. So the idea is that the studies, the preparation, all takes place before the marriage, but not much before. Your marriage is a very important part of the growth of anyone, but especially of a rabbi, in terms of establishing a family and fulfilling the commandments related to that. So a typical day, just to give you, and again, another little more detailed idea of what life in a yeshiva would be like. And this is mostly for the older children. But a typical day starts at 7 in the morning or earlier with immersion in the mikveh. Around 7:30 then or earlier, Hasidic studies begin. This study session followed by morning prayers and breakfast, and then the study of the Talmud. The next would be lunch, and then prayers in the early afternoon, followed by secular studies or more Talmud, depending on the direction of the yeshiva. Studying in both Hebrew and Aramaic, and the encouragement to publish one's own commentaries would be next. Much of the tractates would be memorized that would be read from the Talmud. And then in the late afternoon, the study would focus on the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Laws. Followed that by dinner, and then Hasidic studies until 9 or 10, but many continue to study late into the night. So that gives you an idea of a typical day in a yeshiva for the older students. So you can see the intensity of the study and the importance of knowledge. And this is training for a rabbi, and it's also an important thing to remember when one criticizes rabbinic laws, also called the Oral Torah, and understanding that this kind of intense training is important, just as a lawyer is given intense training, more intensive than anyone else might be given regarding the law. They are given that training so that they can indeed, hopefully, carry out their learning by providing justice in their decisions as they practice their role as lawyer. The same is true for a rabbi. And one of the reasons I would give as to why we should trust and believe that our rabbis can make um, godly decisions that we should follow. So that's, again, just one aspect of a rabbi's trainings in putting their occupation in order. So we're going backwards a little bit here in terms of life cycles. We ran through the life cycle for a rabbi, but before then, or as part of any Jewish child, we have the bar mitzvah. A bar mitzvah is not something one has. It is something one becomes. So you don't say, I'm having a bar mitzvah, or my son had a bar mitzvah. They became a bar mitzvah, would be more appropriate. It's the attainment of an age whereby a child takes on their membership in their community and agrees to the laws and traditions and responsibilities of that community. Judaism established the age of 13 for boys, 12 for girls. This is the age at which, according to Torah law, that da'at, that intellectual maturity and self-awareness develops. According to the Book of Jewish Knowledge, quote, in Judaism, responsibility is not a burden, but a privilege. An obligation is not bemoaned, but celebrated. Hence, the day on which a Jew becomes a bar or bat mitzvah, that is, obligated to fulfill the divine commandments of the Torah, is a joyous day. So again, the term bar mitzvah is son of the covenant, or bat mitzvah would be daughter of the covenant, or of keeping of the mitzvahs. Modern society scoffs at the idea of 13 for manhood because they think it's about being old enough for war or politics, but the most important aspect of life is God, especially and it should be for all people, but especially to Jews. Reform and some other synagogues often treat it as a one-time requirement to chant Torah and do mitzvahs, but it should be a lifetime commitment for both. It wasn't until the Middle Ages that the central act was making an aliyah, being called to the Torah and reading a portion of Torah. Bat mitzvah, the daughters of commandments, was started in 1922. That was added to the Lifecycles for young Jewish women. The next lifestyle then, or not lifestyle, life cycle, would be the wedding and marriage. There's nothing more important in Jewish life than the home. It's for this reason that a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, as Genesis advises. It is the reason that the first letter in Torah is a B, a bet, or a bayit, which means home. It is the place where the first commandment can be fulfilled to be fruitful and multiply, and it all starts with a wedding. The Zohar explains, quote, when the Creator brings forth souls into the world, all souls include both a male and a female aspect, which are bound together as one entity. Then, when they descend into the world, they are separated and are vested in two separate bodies. When the time comes for them to marry, God, who knows each soul and spirit, unites them as they were originally unified. So there's that idea given in Judaism that we find our soulmate as someone who was separated, who has always been and always will be a part of who we are. And that's why it's very important when we enter into a marriage that we're entering into it with the belief that this is God's mate for me, and it is also my soul, the other half of my soul, being reunited. The idea of, and I'll throw this out there as an aside, and this is something that that I believe that isn't necessarily rabbinic in any way, shape, or form. So I don't want to present this as that, but It's for me an important understanding. If God is indeed capable, and I believe he is, of uniting two souls together that were separated, would he not be also capable of uniting them under all circumstances? And what I mean by that is we have a tradition, and my thoughts aren't going to change that tradition. But we have in our tradition that a Jewish man and a Jewish woman are required to to create a Jewish household. That the child takes on the religion of his or her mother, and if his or her mother isn't Jewish, then that child isn't Jewish. And yet, and this is again being very clear, this is my idea, not Judaism, or not the teachings of the rabbi. And yet, I wonder if, because God does know the secret things, if in many cases a so-called non-Jewish woman who marries a Jewish man, or the other way around, a so-called non-Jewish man who marries a Jewish woman, if they are not indeed both Jews, that the one who is non-Jewish is a hidden soul, has a hidden Jewish soul, because of conversions, pogroms, all of the things in the past that that created that division, that dragged people away from their faith of Judaism, and in many cases they have no idea of their Jewish roots because of the forced conversions. At any rate, that's a thought that I have, and it's one of the reasons that I think the Noahide movement is so important. That's the story for another class, which is the Noahide class. But I wanted to put that out here just to say how important it is for men and women to really understand that a soulmate is not someone that you are passionately, you can be, but not necessarily someone that you are passionately connected to, but someone that you are connected to at the soul level, which means that your partner may frustrate you in almost every way, but the purpose of that frustration is often to help you and themselves build their spiritual growth. At any rate, that's a side over. So the marriage is generally arranged in Orthodox communities by a shadchan, a matchmaker. It cannot be forced, and this is a misconception, although not to say this never happened, but uh, but Judaism does not say that a parent can force or should force their child to marry a certain person. But the matchmaker provides what she primarily feels is the best match for the two, and hopefully, being led by God's Spirit, the matchmaker finds the soulmate for the person that she's matching to. So the first step then, after the meetings that take place by the matchmaker between the two parties, and they decide, yes, this indeed is a person that I want to spend the rest of my life with. Um, the next step is the engagement that happens, and there are two parts to that engagement. We have the betrothal, which is the giving of something of value, usually a silver, something silver and gold, which is kind of where the ring came from, the idea of the ring, and a ketubah, which is the marriage document um, that 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 gives the rights of primarily the wife, the woman in the ketubah. But the other thing to note is that the marriage actually takes place at the betrothal. Um, Technically, at the betrothal, the two are now man and wife. But in modern times, that's usually not understood. The ketubah, by the way, it's something that you must have. If you're lost, you can't live together until you have a new one created. It lists the obligations of man to take care for his wife, including her sexual needs, sexual relations. We can find several references to the ketubah in the Talmud, um, and so it again it provides primarily for the woman's spiritual, physical needs, emotional, financial, all of that is laid out or should be laid out in the ketubah. So then the next step being the wedding itself, it fulfills the first commandment. Male 13, female 12 originally was the minimum age that two people could be married. Today it's generally 17 to 18. From the Talmud on, which is about 500 of the Common Era, monogamy was the norm. Now, polygamy has been a part of Judaism history, but again, generally speaking, from 500 of the Common Era on, monogamy was expressed as the norm for a man and a woman. It should be a communal expression of support, the wedding. It's not something you do in a private little building by yourself. The entire community should be involved in it, because the entire community should be involved in your lives from this point on, helping you and encouraging you to grow and to be the best possible family that you can be. And with the community, it binds your past, your present, and your future. The sense of community is expressed in the chuppah. It's open on four sides. The chuppah is the covering that a bride and a groom stand under during the ceremony. Usually it's a talit. So the covering often is or symbolizes a talit, demonstrating being covered by God and his commandments. Part of the wedding ceremony is the shattering of the wine glass or a light bulb, and it represents sorrow and joy. Wine always represents joy. The breaking of it would be sorrow, so it's that combination of two things that both are part of life, and also it's remembrance of the destruction of the temple. Another interesting thing I want to point out is there's a term ish for man and isha for woman. And the significance of that is really very powerful. So the difference between ish and isha is that ish, man, has a yod, this letter here, a yod, and a woman has a hey, this letter here. If you take those two out, and those two represent the first two letters of God's majestic name, the tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He, representing the first two letters of God. If you take God out of a man and a woman, and we're talking now about a husband and a wife, if you take God out of their equation, you're left with Aleph Shin, and that is Aish, which is fire. So without God, you have a very fiery, stormy relationship that takes place. And this is what happens so much in today's times. When we don't honor and see God as the center of our home, the center of our lives, the possibility of divorce becomes much, much, much greater. Taking a look now at the wedding ceremony itself, the order of the service pretty much laid out in the Talmud, and the things that are supposed to be done. The groom makes an aliyah, which is going up to reading of the Torah during a service before the wedding day, and the wedding itself is considered a mini Yom Kippur ceremony. You are supposed to fast and abstain from any relationships. You wear no leather, and so most of the requirements that we have on Yom Kippur, we have on the day before or prior to the wedding itself. Then the kiddushin, the aspect of the wedding, is one place where the bride circles the groom 7 times. First 2 blessings are then given over the wine. You have a ring ceremony. You have the reading of the ketubah. You have the 7 marriage blessings. You have the smashing of the glass. And then the bride and groom will leave the group and stay alone in a locked room for about 10 minutes. Again, all part of the ceremony. And then it continues from there. So that's the order of service and the way that things take place. Now, while we're talking about weddings, let's also then talk about intermarriage, something that is very, again, controversial only in that so many Jews today have a problem with that. And as I mentioned before, um, it's a very real threat, but there may be some silver linings in it. But at any rate, uh, the some of the commentators talk about this as ironic. If what finally destroys the Jewish people is the permissiveness we have here in America, a very real threat. The major function of a marriage in Judaism, as well as being fruitful and multiplying, is to maintain the existence of our traditions. It's the teaching of the children. It's providing a home where the children can learn and grow and become themselves observant Jews. The children of mixed marriages seldom self-identify as Jews, regardless of which parent is Jewish. So we have the idea that intermarriage is a very dangerous and uh, difficult thing. I recently did a book study on Eliezer ben Amozag, I'm sorry, Eliyahu ben Amozag's, a 19th century rabbi from Italy, and he talked about intermarriage as being extremely dangerous, even though much of his commentary in his book Israel and Humanity, or his writing, um, dealt with the importance of Jews and Gentiles coming together and understanding one another. But even with that having been said, he still views intermarriage as something that is in a completely different category. And one of the reasons that he gives is that uh, when Jews and Gentiles come together ideologically, ideas and traditions are both affected, but they're separate. They still remain separate. One person's ideas remain that person's ideas. Another person's ideas remain that person's ideas. They might be affected in a positive way by that interchange, but it doesn't change their separateness. Whereas with marriage, the two become one. You no longer have that separation. So the danger is much greater in that situation. So again, even though many people today will talk about intermarriage as something that is not as bad as it seems, it really is. However, and having said that, and I go back to what I said earlier, that there is still the idea that God brings two people together, whether or not they are two Jews or not. God has to be in control of everything. If he's not God. So my thought, at least, again, not saying that intermarriage is a good thing, and I want to be very clear about that. That I agree, it is a dangerous thing because it does affect. Um, at the very least, if a non-Jew and a Jew are married, it should be with the understanding that the non-Jew is not bringing his or her beliefs into that marriage. That marriage must be must create a Jewish home, period, end of statement. That's the bottom line. But I believe it's possible that a non-Jew and a Jew who are married and who do provide a Jewish home is just is in reality the non-Jew actually has a Jewish soul, and therefore their children are Jewish, whether or not there's that conversion that takes place. At any rate, my opinion, not rabbinic. Rabbinic opinion is intermarriage is very dangerous and very uh, difficult to enable Judaism to survive. Which kind of leads us to the idea of purity. And that's a next lifestyle, if you will, although it's part of the marriage ceremony, the wedding ceremony, but part of life itself. many other laws regarding when sexual relations are prohibited, the use of a mikveh as a demarcation of these times. The idea that, and this is often, I want to say ridiculed, that might be too strong a word. The idea that, yes, it's true, in an observant Jewish household, um, at a certain point in a woman's life, um, the husband and wife are not allowed to have sexual relations until that point is over, and the woman has gone through the mikveh and been purified through it. And for whatever, I mean, you can have all your whatever you want to think about that. But the point here is, and the thing I've heard from many rabbis, is that that does not negate the passion and the love that exists between a husband and wife. And in fact, again, from many rabbis' point of view, it intensifies it because, yes, there are roughly 2 weeks out of every month that you can't have sexual relations because of it. But the 2 weeks that you have together can be even more powerful in terms of that. And again, it's the point. The point of this is that this was a commandment given by God in the Torah, and therefore, the idea is something that if we follow, we can reap very, very strong rewards for. So, and the mikveh is not just for women, of course. Men, many Jewish men, observant Jewish men, every Sabbath morning, and maybe even more often than that, will also themselves use the mikveh as a point of spiritual cleansing and repentance. So the mikveh becomes very, very important. And dealing with another life cycle event, divorce, which is something that we see very sadly in our world, happens far too often. Judaism does allow divorce, and in some cases says that it is necessary, but it's not encouraged. The divorce requires having a get, which is like a ketubah in the opposite sense. A get is where the man gives the woman that permission, if you will, and I know that sounds very sexist, but it is what it is, to have that separation. The groom, in terms of the get, must fulfill the conditions of the ketubah that was originally given. If there are financial aspects of the ketubah, before they can give the get, they have to make sure that those financial arrangements are taken care of. So that's monetarily. The groom has to fulfill those conditions. The bill of divorcement in the past, women had no say, but now both parties must agree. There are situations in some Orthodox communities where this isn't true, but for the most part, this is true nowadays, that a woman has as much of a right as a man to ask for that bill of divorcement. But it is still halakhically only the man that can give give that divorce. And if they choose not to, then there are all kinds of problems that exist as part of that. But at any rate, the interesting thing about the gematria of get is 12, and that's why the gematria has to have 12 handwritten lines. Without the get, the two people are still married as far as Judaism is concerned, and a woman who remarries without the get is considered an adulteress, and their children are not the children of a legitimate marriage. The only place Torah punishes, this is the only place that Torah punishes the innocent for the sins of another. It raises many questions, many concerns, but again, it is considered a commandment, at least certainly a rabbinic commandment, that this takes place. So that's just to give you that idea of divorce. But hopefully, before any divorce happens, the couple has spent time with their rabbi and been counseled in every way possible to express the horrible nature that happens to their children, to themselves in the process of this divorce. As it says, what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. And for Christians, you have an interesting teaching in Jesus that said that there's no reason for a divorce. And interestingly enough, in the first century, there were two Pharisaic schools. One was the school of Hillel, and the other was the school of Shammai. Shammai was the far more strict school, and the school of Shammai had the same attitude as Jesus, Yeshua, supposedly had, and that is that there's no reason for a divorce except under extreme situations of adultery. But otherwise, there's no reason that a divorce should be allowed. The school of Hillel was much more lenient, and it is the school of Hillel that we follow primarily in modern times. And Hillel believed that there were indeed reasons that a divorce should be allowed, and that most of those reasons come under the heading of for the sake of peace. If there's not going to be any peace in the home, then Rabbi Hillel and his school taught that then the divorce is better than not giving it. But again, those are the controversies. So again, divorce allowed, not encouraged, and it requires the get, the document of cutting off, to do it. And now we talk about the last of our physical life cycle, death and dying, funerals and mourning. We'll be taking a look at the whole process there. It discourages the denial of death. I mean, one of the things we see in this life cycle and the idea that Judaism has about it is that death is a part of life, and in some cases, in some teachings, death itself is seen as the ultimate atonement of sin. I suppose for those of you who have followed Christianity, might see in this the distortion of this concept, the idea that death atones for sin. It is not the atonement, and it is not an all-inclusive atonement, but just as suffering is considered an atonement for sin, so too death is seen in the same way. Certainly, death is a part of death involves suffering. So there is that concept that death itself is an atonement. It is not. It has nothing to do with replacing the atonement given through temple sacrifices and rituals, but it is definitely part of the teaching. Just to understand that. We have the recital of the vidue, the confessional on the deathbed, the last words, if possible, that a person should say before dying is the Shema. Judaism opposes euthanasia or assisted suicide or in any way the speeding up of the dying process. Along those same lines, suicide is not permitted. But also knowingly doing things that are detrimental to your health would fall into the same category. Smoking, overeating, substance abuse, poor diet, all of those things technically, in looking at it in a broader context, those things are forms of suicide. When we do things that are detrimental to our bodies, we are killing ourselves, and that is forbidden as far as Judaism is concerned. Blessed be the judge of truth is a blessing that you would say upon hearing of the death of a loved one, or of anyone for that matter. The idea that death is somehow tied with truth and with judgment. So all of that is a part of the process. Judaism does forbid autopsies unless, for criminal reasons. or to determine criminality. But as a general rule, autopsies are not allowed in Judaism. There are no flowers that are given, and the idea of a burial at least within 8 days, generally within 3 days, 24 hours if possible. Again, the point is the respect of the physical. This is something that is, if you will, unique to Judaism, in that the body is considered a very important part of God's purpose for us in this world. So we treat the body, even when the soul may not be within the body. We still treat the body with respect. Part of that denies the possibility of cremation. No, cremation is not allowed. Again, because it is a violence that's done to the body. Now that doesn't mean that people who are burned accidentally in fires, or people who have been burned at the stake or in other ways killed by fire, it doesn't mean that in any way, shape, or form that they have any judgment placed against them. But again, it's the idea of purposely doing this without any reason that is forbidden in Judaism. Accompanying the dead is a very important mitzvah and another part of it. Again, just as the weddings were a community event, so too the funerals and burial services are considered a community event, and it is a mitzvah to accompany the dead to the grave. The other thing that is important for someone who has just recently passed is that you are never allowed to leave the body alone. There always must be someone watching over the body. Again, it's the idea of the respect of this part of God's creation. God created us in the physical form, and even says, as part of the creation, that man was made in the image of God. Again, Judaism definitely opposes any thought that God has a human body. But the body itself is considered, at least mystically, made in the image of God. So therefore, we treat the body, alive or dead, with great respect. So imagine how much more important it is to treat a living person's body with respect. And this speaks to, again, as we mentioned, your own treatment of the body, but it also speaks to society's treatment of the body. This is why healthcare is so important and should be so important to anyone, Christians and Jews, but primarily to Jews, should always be in favor of providing the best healthcare possible for every human being, again, especially now talking about fellow Jews. In terms of, again, getting back to to death, most synagogues, most Torah observant synagogues have a burial society called Chavara Kedusha, which means the Holy Society. This group of people is specifically assigned at the time of a member's death to care for the body, to be with the body 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Hopefully that doesn't take 7 days. As I said, should be buried within 3 days if possible. But all of that has to do with reverence for the body. It means that the body needs to be returned to the state from which it came. From dust you came, and to dust you shall return. That's the idea here. That the body, one of the things that the society does is they'll clean the body. Water is poured over. The body is dressed in white linen with no pockets. Tachrishan as a headdress, trousers, body covering, kittel, robe, a belt, a linen sheet, talit for men with one of the fringes cut. All of those things the body would be dressed with. The idea of the casket, the aron, should be made entirely of wood, usually pine. Doesn't have to be, and perhaps there's some argument that it shouldn't be ornate, because in death we should all be equal, if you will. So we have a very simple casket Um, and if possible, if you're not, if you don't, you don't, if you're not buried in Israel, another tradition is to have a small bag of Israeli dirt that you would keep and bury with you. And again, death is believed to have some atonement properties. At the service itself, so again, we talked about the Holy Society. That the service itself, that you recite Psalm 23, you end with prayers. The rabbi or another person recites the eulogy, um, Ananut and Avelut, states of mourning, Kelia, the tearing of a garment, Kaddish. Each participant at the graveside would put 3 shovelfuls of dirt into the grave. That's again the tradition. So you have those things all taking place by everyone in the community who are participating in that event. And now let's talk about mourning. The stages of mourning very often misunderstood, or at least not often done in non-observant communities, but it's a very important part of it. The idea that the body, the idea of mourning is primarily for the living, but interestingly enough, um, Judaism, or at least mystical Judaism, teaches that it is also important for the dead. But when we sit Shiva, Shiva means 7, you visit the home just for company. You're not even supposed to speak, but there's certainly no need to speak. You eat very simple foods. Bread and eggs or chickpeas are pretty common. The mirrors are covered. Evening prayer is said in the home. Kaddish is said in the home. The family mourns for 7 days with no return to normalcy before then. There's nothing, you shouldn't do any event that you would normally do for those 7 days, which is why, again, it's very important for this to be a community event where meals are brought in. Every need for the mourner is taken care of. So all that they do during those 7 days is mourn, is remember, is think about the person that's died. The mourner will sit low. Doesn't have to be on the floor, but usually there'll be a low seat that's provided for the mourners. Um, the requirement for mourning: uh, you're required to mourn for your father, for your mother, for your sister, for your brother, for your son or daughter, or for your spouse. So again, immediate family members is who you're required to do the Shiva, the 7 days of mourning for. The first day is customarily just family only, no one else in the house. The mitzvah then is to provide a minyan for praying at home. So at least 10 men should be present at a mourner's home to do the prayers. That is suspended for Shabbat. But on the 7th day, a friend then escorts the mourner for a walk outside. The idea here is now we're breaking that process of mourning. We're now moving from mourning into a normal life. Kaddish, although one form of the Kaddish is recited in memory of the dead, the prayer itself actually says nothing about death. Its theme is the greatness of God reflected in its opening words, Yitkadal v'yitkadash may Rabbah, may his name be magnified and made holy. The prayer's conclusion speaks of a future age in which God will redeem the world, and as part of that, the resurrection of the dead. You recite Kaddish for 11 months for a parent, or 30 days for anyone else. And we'll talk a little bit more about this 11 months to come up in the next slide, I think. But at any rate, so that's the tradition: 11 months for a parent, or 30 days for anyone else. The Shloshim, the next 30 days, is spent in mourning, and that's where you do say Kaddish during that time. Everyone does. That's part of the 30 days, the next 30 days of mourning. But other than saying Kaddish during that time, there's not much different that you would do. You can uncover the mirrors. Everything else is sort of back to normal in that time. Interesting. The covering of the mirrors again has mystical implications. One of the mystical implications is that Judaism teaches that it is very possible that in the first 30 days, or certainly the first 7 days during sitting Shiva, that the deceased himself or herself actually continues to cling to those things that he or she is familiar with, which would be the family, the home. So you don't want any possibility that the deceased might look in the mirror and not see himself or see himself. I don't really know quite how that works, but the idea is that it's done out of respect for the person who's dead. So again, mystical, but it makes sense. It makes sense that again the soul is going to be confused at the very beginning. The soul is going to be having a difficult time accepting his or her death, and they're going to cling to those that they're familiar with, which is why that time of mourning, that time of the 7 days, is very important, where the relative of the one who died is focusing on that person, sending them prayers, sending them love, wishing them well on their next journey, if you will. The gravestone is the next event that takes place in the process, matziva, and it's within a year of the death. Some only wait 30 days, but generally a year. And that's where you have the unveiling of the tombstone, the gravestone, which is generally covered for either 30 days or a year. And then there's a ceremony to uncover it. Also, the tradition that no flowers are left at the grave site, only stones. Various traditions behind that, but in part, again, flowers wilt and die. And so that's not the message that you want to send when you are adorning the gravestone. So here for me is the most interesting part of the process of death and dying, and that is the afterlife. And most of the information we're going to talk about here is Kabbalistic. It is mystical, not specifically talked of from Torah itself, but it just makes sense, and it deals with the journey of the soul, and we'll talk about some different ideas in terms of that. So I mentioned the first 7 days, the time of mourning. The first 7 days for the deceased are generally, according to Jewish tradition, are ones of confusion. They'll often cling to those closest to them as they're in the process of acceptance. Again, the importance of accompanying the dead to the grave so that they have surrounding them friends, and they can see that. The next 30 days are a gradual releasing, and that's again why 30 days for everyone is a requirement in terms of saying Kaddish. It's a gradual releasing from the bonds of earth to head into the next phase of their journey. So we have, again, as part of Jewish tradition, that importance of that 30 days is to recognize that soul is in the process of leaving this earth. They may not leave immediately, and generally they do not, again, according to Jewish tradition. So we have that 30 days of allowing them to be released from the bonds of earth to complete that part of the journey. The Talmud teaches that the truly wicked could spend a year in Gehenna. So this is the next cycle that is interesting to talk about. Judaism doesn't believe in a hell in the way that Christianity believes in it. Interestingly enough, the teaching in Judaism is very similar to the Catholic teaching of purgatory. And there's no doubt in my mind that that's where the idea of purgatory came from. But the Catholic or Christian idea of purgatory is that it can last forever. Judaism does not teach that. It teaches that the most a soul would need to spend in Gehenna, in a place of cleansing, is 12 months. That would be the absolute most wicked person that you can imagine. They might need 12 months to be cleansed, which is another reason why, humorously, I suppose, that when you're praying for a parent, you only pray 11 months because you don't want to send the message that you think that person is so wicked that they're going to be there the whole 12 months. So I find that very humorous, but it is, and again, that's part of the beauty of Judaism for me, certainly, and for many people, is that within this time of very serious sadness, there's also a great deal of humor. But anyway, so you pray 11 months so that you don't want your loved one to think that you think that they're that wicked. Some will fast on the yahrzeit, that is the 1 year observance of the death, and some may not. It's not a requirement. So let's talk now. This is from Rabbi Ben-Zion Kravitz, a beautiful writing that he did in terms and entitled "The Journey of the Soul, Its Mission and Afterlife." Subtitle: What is the makeup of the soul and what happens when it leaves the body? So these are all, these words are from Rabbi Kravitz. In the Torah, 3 words are used to describe the soul as it vests itself in a body: nefesh, ruach, and neshama. There's actually 2 other levels of souls that he doesn't talk about here. But they're found in the following passages. The soul, life nefesh, of the flesh is in the blood, Leviticus 17:11. The dust returns to the ground as it was, and the spirit, ruach, returns to God who gave it. And then the third quote from Ecclesiastes 12:7 says, God formed man out of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils a soul, neshama, of life. So those are the 3 levels of souls that he's talking about here. These 3 parts of the soul, continuing from Rabbi Kravitz, these 3 parts of the soul are alluded to in King Solomon's statement: the candle of God is the soul of man, Proverbs 20:27. The 2 letters of the word candle, ner, can be seen as an acronym for nefesh ruach, nefesh and ruach, and the word for neshama is found at the end of the verse in the word neshmat. Neshama means breath, ruach means wind. The word nefesh from vayinafash means to rest, as in the following verse: for 6 days God made heaven and earth, and on the 7th day he ceased from work and rested. Rabbi Schneur Zalman explains that the Torah's use of the word breath to describe the neshama is to teach that it comes from the essence of God, and he refers to it as a part of God. Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, 1934 to 1983, provides additional insights into this metaphor, saying God's exhaling a soul can be compared to a glass blower forming a vessel. The breath, neshama, first leaves his lips, travels as a wind, ruach, and finally comes to rest, nefesh, in the vessel. Of these 3 levels of the soul, neshama is therefore the highest and closest to God, while nefesh is that aspect of the soul residing in the body. Ruach stands between the 2, binding man to his spiritual source. It is for this reason that divine inspiration is called Ruach HaKodesh in Hebrew. The Torah is teaching us that the human soul came directly from God's innermost essence, in the same way that a breath issues forth from a person's lungs and chest cavity. The rest of creation, on the other hand, was created with speech, which is a lower level. So we see that the lofty soul's descent into a physical body serves a purpose: the elevation of the soul and the revelation of God's presence in the most concealed aspects of the physical existence. What happens when the person completes their mission and returns their soul to God? Judaism teaches that the soul is now able to come closer to God's essence than it could before its descent into the physical world. The Torah and mitzvot the person observed during their lifetime elevated the soul to a higher state of intimacy with God due to his or her having been connected to God's will and wisdom while in a physical body. This progression to a higher level of intimacy with God is alluded to in Zechariah 3:7 that says, "If you go in my ways, then I will give you a place to move among the angels standing here." Unquote. However, blemishes that the soul may have acquired while in a body need to be cleansed because they can obstruct the soul's perception and appreciation of godliness. The transitory cleansing of the soul is alluded to by King David in Psalm 16:10, says, "You will not abandon my soul to purgatory." Unquote. Transgressions form blemishes that become obstacles between the soul and God, preventing the light of the soul from reconnecting to the source that it came from. As it says in Isaiah 59:2, "But your iniquities have been a barrier between you and your God. Your sins have made him turn his face away and refuse to hear you." Sins are compared to a cloud that prevents us from seeing the sun. As it says in Isaiah 44:22, "I will wipe away your sins like a cloud and your transgression like a mist." So imagine trying to point a powerful laser at the sun. In the vacuum of outer space, it will travel uninterrupted and be absorbed into the sun. However, if we shine from Earth, the specks of dust and moisture in the atmosphere impede it from reaching its goal. These specks represent the blemishes. During one's lifetime, one's soul can be cleansed through repentance, known as teshuvah. Judaism, refers to this cleansing process after death as Gehenna. It is not the eternal damnation of Greek mythology or Christianity, but a temporary purgatory that purges the soul of its blemishes. Our sages teach a valuable lesson based on the heartfelt reflection of King Solomon concerning death, when he said, death, is the end of every person, and the living should take to heart, Ecclesiastes 7:2. That we should increase in learning Torah and doing mitzvah, especially charity in the memory of the departed. This is the purpose of the saying of Kiddush and keeping Yartzeit for the ultimate reconnection with our departed loved ones in the Messianic age, when, as we are promised in Isaiah 26:19, your dead will live, their bodies will rise, awake and sing, you who dwell in the dust. Unquote. Two final levels of the soul, as I mentioned, are at the upper end. The Chaya and Yechida. Yechida is hardwired to God, and so we have very little connection to it in life. And Chaya is that place of revelation, that place that is without time and space, where we can see the future, we can see the past, we can travel, etc. So those two parts aren't included or talked about in Rabbi Kravitz's discussion. From Rabbi David Rosenfeld, we have the following: the journey of the soul follows a pattern immediately upon a person's death. Kabbalistic sources state that the soul is granted a glimpse of God's divine presence. The soul feels a deep sense of serenity, of being at peace with itself, as if it is preparing to return home. Jewish literature records cases of great rabbis immediately prior to their deaths announcing the souls which had come to accompany them to their next world. Likewise, many pious people, Jews and non-Jews, have died mentioning the names of their parents or other close relatives who had come to greet them. No doubt the moment of death is very frightening for a soul. The presence of familiar faces greatly helps smooth the transition and calms the person down. At that point, one would expect that the soul would then rise straight to heaven for judgment, but interestingly, that doesn't appear to occur immediately. There's a clear assumption in Jewish literature that the deceased soul is present for quite some time after its death, certainly until the burial, and quite possibly until its body fully decomposes. The Talmud states that the deceased soul is aware of everything spoken in the presence of its body, and it records a debate, if this is true, until the burial or until the body decays. It likewise states, this is from Shabbat 152 A and B, it likewise states that the soul mourns over its own body during the entire week of mourning, and that for the entire first year after death, the soul goes back and forth, alternating between heaven and its buried remains. Finally, at the conclusion of the year of mourning, The worthy find total peace in heaven. Again, all that from Talmud Shabbat 152. Many of the laws of caring for the body and making the funeral preparations are predicated on the assumption that the deceased soul is present and cares deeply how its body is treated and how he or she is eulogized. For example, people may not perform any mitzvah unrelated to the burial in the presence of the body, because the deceased would be pained seeing others doing a mitzvah it can no longer do. They may also not speak of unrelated matters. In addition, and needless to say, any sort of willful neglect of the body or damage done to it, such as through an autopsy or cremation, both of which are strictly forbidden by Jewish law, causes horrific agony to the soul. Rabbi Arya Kaplan explains what transpires as follows. After its death, the soul requires time to become oriented. It is unaccustomed to living without a body in a holy spiritual state. It's aware of its surroundings, not through physical sight, no doubt receiving much more input than it did during its lifetime, and it requires time to adjust to this. It looks to the world for its grounding and is naturally drawn to the object most familiar to it of all, its body. Thus, the soul is assumed to remain in the proximity of its body throughout the funeral procession, and funerals are observed with this in mind. Likewise, the soul is terribly pained viewing its body's decay. The Talmud states that a worm in a corpse is as painful to the deceased as a needle entering the body of a living person. Brachot 18b. This actually serves as a partial atonement for the deceased's sins and is known as the punishment of chibut hakever, literally the knock of the grave. Rabbi Kaplan continues that no doubt the degree to which the deceased is drawn after its body depends greatly on how physical the person was during his lifetime. If a person's body, its comforts, and its pleasures were very significant to him, his soul will not pull itself away from its body until it fully decays or even beyond. If, however, a person was more spiritual during his lifetime, his body and its fate will matter much less to him. The Talmud likewise states that the death of the righteous is comparable to, quote, drawing a hair from milk, unquote, whereas a painful death is as tearing out thorny branches from a sheep's wool. Let's next talk about reincarnation. Again, a very interesting topic. Some Jews won't be aware that reincarnation is part of Judaism, but it definitely is. Certainly a part of Hasidic and Orthodox and mystical Judaism. Many Hasidic and Orthodox believe that reincarnation is possible. Some say only 3 times. Some say more often is necessary. It is also believed that one can reincarnate as an animal, a plant, or even a mineral, depending on the severity of learning of your soul's needs. There are many Hasidic stories that talk about a soul coming back into the form of a horse or a stone or etc. So we have the idea that reincarnation is definitely a teaching as part of of Judaism, and the purpose of reincarnation, it just makes sense that if God's desire for us as souls inhabiting physical bodies is to learn, and this is the only place we can learn is in the physical, the things that we need to learn here, it would make sense that 70 years or less or more is just not enough for that learning process. So we come back. The idea of the coming back 3 times, the teaching behind that is that a very wicked person is given 3 opportunities to begin the process of repentance and of changing their ways. If by the end of the 3rd time they have shown no remorse, no level of growth, then that's it. That's the end of their process. But for the person who is not totally wicked, they can come back unlimited times, as much as it takes to enable them to learn. As long as within each time there's some learning process, some growth that's taking place, then that is something that is important to God. God does not desire the death of the wicked, Scripture says, but indeed reincarnation enables us to truly understand God's great love for us, his children, to learn and to grow. So that's the process of reincarnation, and that concludes the life cycles that we'll be looking at in this class. So again, thanks for joining me for Judaism 101, as we have taken a look at life cycles. The next class, we'll take a look at the festivals and how they're celebrated. So I hope you'll join me for that. For Yeshiva B'nai Noach, I'm Tom Averna. Shalom.